Lyra Bennett was 65, a retired high school art teacher from a quiet coastal town. For most of her life, she had been known for her gentle smile and her love for painting sunsets. But in the last few years, something had begun to change. Her hands, once steady enough to guide the most delicate brushstrokes, had started to ache. Her knees protested after a simple walk to the market, and on cold mornings her chest felt tight, as if the winter air had found its way deep inside her. She brushed it off at first, blaming age or the weather, but deep down, a quiet fear had begun to grow. One autumn afternoon, while reaching for a jar on the top kitchen shelf, Lyra felt a sharp pain ripple down her arm. It was enough to make her stop and sit at the table, rubbing her shoulder. The next week, she found herself in her doctor's office, listening as he spoke about circulation, inflammation, and the importance of caring for her heart before small signs became bigger problems. He spoke gently, but his words landed heavily. He suggested she rethink not just her exercise, but the little things she put on her plate every day. "Your kitchen," he said, "might hold more power than your medicine cabinet." That night, Lyra stood in her kitchen, looking at the shelves with new eyes. Her gaze landed on a small glass jar tucked behind the sugar and tea. Cayenne pepper. She hadn't touched it in years, not since her husband passed because he never liked spicy food. She opened it, inhaling its warm, fiery scent. Something about it felt alive, full of energy, as though it had been waiting patiently for her to notice it again. The next morning, she sprinkled just a pinch into her scrambled eggs, a small change, barely worth mentioning. But over the next week, she found herself doing it again and again, on soups, on roasted vegetables, even stirring it into a little olive oil to drizzle over bread. It was as though her body recognized something it had been missing. The stiffness in her fingers eased. Breathing felt lighter, as if the air could reach deeper into her lungs. She even noticed her walks becoming a little longer without the same heavy fatigue. I remember the first time she told me about it, sitting in my clinic with that same gentle smile she'd worn years before. "It's strange," she said, "but it feels like a spark has come back." I explained to her how something as simple as cayenne pepper, rich in capsaicin, antioxidants, and vitamins, could warm the blood, soothe inflammation, and support her heart in ways that pills sometimes couldn't. She didn't need the science to believe it. She could feel it. In truth, Lyra's story is not rare. So many people, especially as they pass 60, carry small aches, lingering fatigue, or quiet worries about their health. They think these things are simply the cost of getting older. But sometimes the path to feeling better begins with something as humble as a spice jar in the back of your pantry. That's why today I want to share with you the 10 remarkable ways cayenne pepper can protect and transform your health. The very same ways that brought color back into Lyra's days. It began with something so small, most people wouldn't have thought twice about it. Lyra stood in her kitchen on a quiet Thursday morning, the sunlight spilling across the tiled floor, warming the backs of her hands. She was making her usual breakfast, scrambled eggs with a little cheese, when her eyes drifted to the small jar of cayenne pepper on the top shelf. It had been there for years, pushed behind jars of cinnamon and turmeric, a relic from when her husband was still alive. He had never liked spicy food, so the pepper had been quietly forgotten. But that morning, without overthinking it, Lyra reached for it. She twisted the lid, and a warm, earthy scent rose up to meet her, sharp yet inviting. She hesitated, spoon in hand, and then sprinkled just the tiniest pinch over her eggs. It didn't look like much, but when she took her first bite, something about it made her pause. There was a spark of heat, a brightness that seemed to wake up her senses. She laughed quietly to herself, wondering why she'd ignored it for so long. It was a small pleasure, but a real one. Later that day, while walking to the market, she noticed something unexpected. Her knees, which usually complained halfway up the hill, seemed a little less stiff. She brushed it off as a good day, nothing more. But when she told me about it later, sitting in my clinic with that soft curiosity in her eyes, I told her there was more to that tiny pinch than she realized. Cayenne pepper wasn't just heat, it was full of capsaicin, a compound that could help warm her blood, ease inflammation, and even boost circulation. She listened, leaning forward slightly, the way she always did when something truly interested her. That night, she told her daughter over the phone about the strange coincidence, the pepper, the easier walk. Her daughter laughed and teased her about turning into one of those people who swore by miracle spices. But for Lyra, it wasn't about miracles. It was about noticing a change in her body, no matter how small, and wondering if it was a door worth opening. Over the next few days, she found herself reaching for that jar again. A pinch on roasted vegetables, a dusting over soup, even a little stirred into olive oil before drizzling it over warm bread. She didn't yet think of it as a habit, it was more like an experiment. But in those moments, she felt a quiet joy. And deep down, she suspected that this tiny burst of flavor was awakening more than just her taste buds. It was awakening the possibility that change, even after 60, could begin with something as small as a pinch. A week later, Lyra was back in my clinic, this time for her routine checkup. She walked in with her scarf neatly wrapped, cheeks a little flushed from the crisp morning air. As she settled into the chair across from me, I noticed something subtle. Her posture seemed lighter, less guarded. There was a faint glimmer in her expression, the kind people wear when they have a small secret to share. "So," I began, "how have you been feeling since we last talked?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Honestly, better than I expected. I've been experimenting a little." She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if confessing something slightly mischievous. "Cayenne pepper," I chuckled. "Ah, so the jar is finally getting some use?" "Yes. At first I thought it was just in my head, but my knees don't ache quite as much, and even my morning walks feel easier. I don't get that same heavy feeling halfway through." I nodded because I'd heard this before, not from her, but from others who discovered that certain foods, when used regularly, could quietly change how they felt day to day. "It's not magic, Lyra," I said gently, "but cayenne pepper can do something remarkable for your circulation. It helps your blood vessels relax and improves the way oxygen moves through your body. That might be why your walks feel easier." She listened intently, her fingers absently smoothing the edge of her scarf. "I thought it was just me imagining things," she murmured. "Not at all," I replied. "When your circulation improves, it's like your whole system wakes up. Your muscles work better, your joints feel looser, and even your energy lifts. It's subtle, but it adds up." Lyra told me how she had started adding it to her soups, her eggs, and even a few slices of bread dipped in oil. She described it the way some people talk about finding a forgotten piece of music, a flavor that brought something alive again. I encouraged her to keep going, but to be mindful. "It's powerful, so don't overdo it. Just a little each day is enough to keep your blood warm and your heart happy." She laughed softly. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say a little spice kept the heart young." "Well," I said, she wasn't wrong. That afternoon, as she left the clinic, I watched her walk toward the street. Her steps were still careful, but they had a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. For people like Lyra, who had carried years of stiffness and fatigue as if they were just part of getting older, moments like these mattered. It wasn't just about physical change, it was about the possibility of life opening up again in small, delicious ways. Later, she told me her daughter had noticed the difference too. "You're not limping as much, Mum," she'd said during a weekend visit. Lyra had smiled and shrugged, not wanting to make a fuss, but inside she felt a little proud. Not because she'd done something dramatic, but because she'd listened to her body and made a simple choice that was already giving something back. For many people, those choices start small. A pinch of spice, a walk around the block, a glass of water before bed. They don't seem like much at first, but together they form a quiet rebellion against the idea that aging means surrendering to aches, fatigue, and decline. And for Lyra, cayenne pepper had become that small, daily act of defiance. A warm, red sprinkle of possibility that reminded her she was still in charge of her own story. It was a rainy Tuesday when Lyra first noticed the change in a way she couldn't ignore. She was sitting by her kitchen window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching the raindrops chase each other down the glass. Normally, days like this sank into her bones, the dampness making her joints ache, her fingers stiff, her mood heavy. But this time felt different. Her knees didn't throb, her hands felt warmer. Even her usual mid-morning slump hadn't come. She thought back to the past few weeks. Every morning, she'd reach for the little glass jar of cayenne pepper without even thinking about it anymore. It had slipped quietly into her daily rhythm. A pinch in her breakfast, a little more in her lunchtime soup, sometimes even sprinkled over roasted carrots for dinner. She hadn't expected much from such a small habit, but something was shifting inside her. That afternoon, she went out to the corner shop despite the drizzle. As she walked, she realized her steps had more spring than usual. She didn't feel that familiar tug of fatigue pulling at her halfway there. And when she reached the shop, the shopkeeper, a kind woman who'd known Lyra for years, looked up and said, "You're glowing today." "What's your secret?" Lyra laughed, embarrassed. "If I told you it was cayenne pepper, you'd think I'd gone mad." But the truth was, it wasn't just her energy. She'd caught sight of herself in the mirror the other morning and noticed her skin looked a little brighter, the fine lines around her eyes softer. There was a hint of color in her cheeks she hadn't seen in years. She wasn't sure if it was the pepper itself, the better circulation, or simply the fact that she was feeling more alive, but it was real enough for her to notice. When she told me about it during her next visit, I nodded knowingly. "Good circulation does more than warm your hands and feet," I explained. "It feeds your skin, brings nutrients to the surface, helps it stay supple, and cayenne pepper helps keep your blood moving freely." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "So it's like I'm watering my own garden?" I smiled. "Exactly. A well-fed garden blooms, and so does a well-fed body." Lyra began experimenting a little more. She mixed a small pinch of cayenne into a jar of olive oil and kept it by the stove, drizzling it over almost everything. She even tried a new recipe she'd found, roasted sweet potatoes with a honey cayenne glaze, and was surprised when her neighbor asked for the recipe after tasting it. It wasn't lost on her that this tiny spice, forgotten in her cupboard for years, was now shaping her days. And not just physically, there was a lightness in her mood that hadn't been there before. She found herself humming while cooking, staying a little longer on her walks, calling friends just to chat. Even her sleep seemed deeper, the kind that left her waking up with the sun instead of dragging herself out of bed. Her daughter noticed it too during their Sunday lunch. "Mom, you seem lighter, happier." Lyra just smiled. "Maybe I am." For so long, she'd accepted the slow dimming of her energy as inevitable. But now she was beginning to believe something different, that a small change, repeated every day, could ripple out into every corner of her life. And that thought, more than anything, filled her with a kind of quiet hope she hadn't felt in years. One Saturday morning, Lyra met her oldest friend, Margaret, for coffee at the small cafe by the harbor. The two had known each other for nearly 4 decades, their friendship woven through years of shared stories, tears, and countless cups of tea. Margaret had always been the observant type, and she was studying Lyra now with an expression that was part curiosity, part suspicion. "You look different," Margaret said finally, tilting her head. "Not just in your face, in your whole self. You're, I don't know, brighter somehow," Lyra laughed. "You sound like my daughter." "Well, she's right," Margaret pressed. "What's going on? Did you start a new skin cream? A new walking group? You're not hiding a romance from me, are you?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, no," Lyra said, shaking her head. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice like she was letting Margaret in on a secret. "It's cayenne pepper." Margaret blinked. "The spice?" "Yes," Lyra said, unable to hide her smile. "It started as a tiny thing, just a pinch in my eggs one morning. But then I started noticing changes. My joints hurt less. I'm walking longer without feeling tired. My skin feels healthier. Even my mood is better." Margaret chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "So now you're telling me a bit of pepper is the fountain of youth?" Lyra shrugged, but her eyes sparkled. "I'm telling you it's made a difference, and it's not just in my head. My doctor explained how it helps with circulation, inflammation, even energy. I didn't expect much, but here we are." They sipped their coffee, the sea breeze drifting through the open window. Margaret tapped her mug thoughtfully. "I've been struggling with my knees lately. Feels like they lock up whenever I sit too long. Maybe I should give it a try." Lyra smiled knowingly. "Start small, a pinch a day, see what happens." That afternoon, Margaret stopped by Lyra's house, still curious. "Show me how you use it," she said, stepping into the kitchen. Lyra pulled the little jar from its shelf, measuring a small amount into her palm. "This is all you need," she explained, sprinkling it into a pan of sautéing vegetables. The scent filled the room, warm, rich, alive. Margaret leaned over the pan, inhaling deeply. "That smells comforting," Margaret admitted. They sat together at the table, sharing the vegetables with some warm bread and olive oil. Margaret took her first bite and smiled. "It's got a kick, but not too much." "That's the trick," Lyra said. "You don't overwhelm the dish, just enough to wake it up." As they ate, Lyra told her more about the mornings she'd woken without joint stiffness, the walks that felt easier, the way her hands no longer ached after long afternoons knitting or painting. She spoke softly, without exaggeration, but with the conviction of someone who had lived the change herself. By the time Margaret left, she was clutching a small jar of cayenne pepper Lyra had scooped out for her. "We'll see if I'm glowing in a month," she joked. But for Lyra, it was more than just sharing a spice. It was sharing hope, the idea that even in their 60s, they still had the power to make small choices that could shift how they felt day to day. When I later saw Lyra and she told me about this exchange, I smiled. "That's how it spreads," I said. "One story, one kitchen, one person at a time." She nodded. "I guess it's not just about what the pepper's done for me. It's about knowing I can still change things. And that feels good." That night, Lyra sprinkled her usual pinch into her dinner. But this time, she thought of Margaret doing the same across town. Two friends, sharing more than just a meal, but a quiet determination to keep their bodies and their spirits as alive as the fire in that little red powder. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning, the kind where nothing seemed urgent. Lyra had just finished her breakfast, a slice of toast drizzled with her now favorite olive oil and cayenne pepper blend, when she decided to tackle a bit of gardening. The air was crisp, the hydrangeas were begging for a trim, and she felt energetic enough to do it. But halfway through pulling a stubborn weed, she felt a sharp tug in her lower back. She froze, her hands gripping the damp earth. It wasn't the dull stiffness she sometimes had after a long walk. This was sharper, deeper. She straightened slowly, wincing. For a moment, the old fear crept back in. Was this the beginning of something worse? She made her way inside, moving carefully, and sat down with a cup of warm tea. The ache lingered, heavy and distracting. By the afternoon, she called her daughter, trying to keep her voice light. "I might have overdone it in the garden today," she admitted. Her daughter, always quick to worry, immediately said, "Mum, promise me you'll see the doctor if it doesn't ease up. You've been feeling so good lately, don't push it." By the next day, the pain was still there, though softer. That's when she came to see me. She sat across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap, and gave me that look, a mix of frustration and resignation. "I was starting to believe I was getting stronger," she said quietly. "And now this." I leaned forward. "Lyra, progress isn't a straight line. You've been moving more, feeling lighter, and yes, you've pushed your body in new ways. Sometimes it protests, but that doesn't erase all the steps forward you've made." She sighed, looking unconvinced. "It just rattled me. I don't want to go back to where I was before." I reminded her of something important, that her body was better prepared to recover now than it had been months ago. "Your circulation's improved, your inflammation is lower, your body has resources it didn't have before. That means this little setback will heal faster." Over the next few days, Lyra took things slowly. She rested more, avoided bending too much, and focused on nourishing herself. But she didn't abandon her new habits. Every morning, she still sprinkled that familiar pinch of cayenne over her breakfast. She still added it to her soups and roasted vegetables. It wasn't just routine anymore, it was a part of who she was becoming. And sure enough, within a week, the pain had eased. She could bend without wincing, walk without stiffness. That first afternoon, she stepped back into the garden. She stood for a moment, taking in the quiet rustle of leaves. This time, she approached her plants gently, pacing herself, feeling grateful that her body had carried her back here. When she told me about it at her next checkup, she smiled for the first time that day. "I thought the setback meant I was losing everything I'd gained," she admitted. "But maybe it just showed me how much stronger I already am." "That's exactly it," I said. "The real progress isn't just in how you feel when everything's perfect, it's in how you recover when it isn't." She nodded slowly, as if letting that truth settle in. And later, when she told Margaret about it over the phone, her friend simply said, "See, you're tougher than you think." That night, Lyra sat at her kitchen table, dinner in front of her, and sprinkled that fiery red powder over her roasted vegetables. She didn't think of it as a magic cure, but she did think of it as a quiet ally, a reminder that even when life pushes her back a step, she has the strength and the small daily habits to move forward again. By early spring, Lyra's days had settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and quietly satisfying. The garden was beginning to stir with life again, tiny shoots pushing through the soil, and she found herself mirroring that renewal. The stiffness in her joints no longer dictated her mornings. Her walks to the market, once a careful balancing act between fatigue and determination, now felt like an easy pleasure. One morning, as she returned from buying fresh bread, she caught herself carrying 2 bags instead of 1. It wasn't until she set them down on the kitchen counter that she realized she hadn't once thought about whether she could manage it. No hesitation, no grimace, just movement. She stood there for a moment, smiling quietly at the small victory. That afternoon, Margaret came over for tea. The two sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs, while the scent of cayenne and roasted pumpkin drifted from the oven. Margaret had her own little jar of cayenne now, and she'd begun adding it to her stews and soups. She leaned in and whispered like she was telling a secret. "I walked up the hill to the post office yesterday without stopping once. First time in months." Lyra grinned. "See, I told you it was worth a try." But it wasn't just the walking or the easier mornings. There were other changes, subtler ones. She noticed she wasn't shivering as easily when the wind turned cold. Her fingers, once so easily chilled, now stayed warm even on blustery afternoons. She could kneel in the garden for half an hour without her knees feeling like they'd lock. And at night, she was sleeping more deeply, waking before her alarm with the kind of alertness she'd almost forgotten was possible. One evening, her daughter invited her to dinner. It was a small family gathering, and as Lyra helped in the kitchen, her granddaughter asked, "Grandma, why are you moving so fast today?" Lyra laughed, realizing she'd been darting between the counter and the stove without even thinking about her knees or her back. She tousled her granddaughter's hair. "Guess I've just got a bit more spring in me these days." When she told me about this, I smiled and said, "These are the victories that matter most, the ones you almost don't notice until you stop and think about them." She nodded, clearly savoring the thought. She also noticed a shift in how she carried herself. There was a confidence in her movements, a sense that her body could still answer when she asked something of it. And in that confidence, there was freedom, the freedom to say yes to a walk with a friend, to tend her garden a little longer, to linger at the market without worrying if her legs would give her trouble on the way home. Her kitchen had become a place of quiet ritual. Every morning, she reached for that same glass jar, tapping a little cayenne into her eggs or sprinkling it over her toast. Sometimes she mixed it into olive oil, letting it seep overnight so she could drizzle it over roasted vegetables the next day. She never measured precisely anymore. Her hand had learned the right amount by feel alone. To someone else, it might look like a small habit, barely worth mentioning. But to Lyra, it was the thread that tied her new days together. And every time she saw that little burst of red against her food, she felt a small spark of gratitude. Gratitude that her body still had room for change. Gratitude that life could still offer her these little victories, not in grand, dramatic moments, but in the quiet, everyday ways that made her feel alive. It was Margaret's idea. "We should go to the botanical gardens next weekend," she said one afternoon over tea. "We haven't been in years, and the magnolias are starting to bloom." Lyra hesitated. The gardens were beautiful, yes, but they were also sprawling. Hills, winding paths, and far more walking than her usual trips to the market. Before, she would have politely declined, making some excuse about being busy. But now, something in her said, "Why not?" That Saturday, the two set off early. The sun was warm but gentle, the sky a soft blue with wisps of white cloud drifting lazily overhead. Lyra had packed a small lunch, crusty bread, cheese, fresh fruit, and almost without thinking, a tiny jar of her cayenne-infused olive oil for drizzling. As they entered the gardens, the air was alive with scent, roses, fresh grass, the faint sweetness of early blooms. They started along the main path, pausing to admire the magnolias in their creamy, blushing glory. Lyra noticed the ground beneath her feet, the gentle slope of the path, the way her body adjusted without protest. Her breathing stayed steady, her legs felt solid. She wasn't pushing herself, she was simply moving, and it felt natural. Margaret, walking beside her, grinned. "You're keeping up with me better than I am," Lyra laughed, shaking her head. "Don't jinx it." They wandered for hours, stopping often to admire a rare orchid here, a cluster of wildflowers there. Lyra's eyes kept catching the bright splashes of red tulips and thinking, "That's exactly the shade of my cayenne pepper." Around midday, they found a quiet bench beneath a willow tree. Lyra pulled out their lunch, slicing the bread, laying out the cheese, and with a small flourish, drizzling the cayenne oil over it. Margaret took a bite and sighed. "You've spoiled me. Now plain bread just won't do." As they ate, Lyra realized something important. She wasn't thinking about her knees. She wasn't worrying about how much farther they had to walk. She wasn't calculating how much energy she had left for the trip back. She was simply there, present, enjoying the food, the company, the sunshine dappling through the willow branches. When they finally made their way toward the exit, the pedometer on Margaret's phone buzzed. "Nearly 8,000 steps," she said, eyebrows raised. That's impressive." Lyra stopped in her tracks. 8,000? Months ago, she wouldn't have dreamed of reaching that number without feeling completely drained. Yet here she was, still smiling, still steady on her feet. The ride home was quiet, the kind of peaceful tiredness that comes after a day well spent. That evening, as Lyra sat in her kitchen sipping tea, she thought about what had just happened. This day, this gentle triumph, was proof that her body had changed, and not just in ways she could measure. She'd stepped back into parts of life she'd quietly set aside, thinking they were beyond her now, and all of it had begun with a small jar of spice in the back of her cupboard. When she told me about it at her next appointment, her eyes lit up in a way I'll never forget. "It's not just that I could do it," she said, "it's that I wasn't afraid to try." That, I told her, is what strength really is. Not just the power in your muscles, but the trust you have in them. From then on, the gardens became more than just a pleasant memory. They became a reminder that sometimes the real measure of progress is not in the scale, the mirror, or the test results, but in the courage to say yes to a day you might once have declined. The following week, Lyra walked into the local market with her usual canvas bag over her shoulder. She liked shopping in the mid-morning when the air was still fresh from the night and the stalls weren't yet crowded. The scent of ripe peaches and fresh herbs greeted her as she stepped inside. She made her way toward the vegetable stall where Mr. Harris, the owner, stood arranging baskets of bright peppers and leafy greens. "Good morning, Lyra," he called, his voice warm as always. But then he paused, tilting his head in that slightly puzzled way people do when they notice something they can't quite name. "You've got a spring in your step today. Been doing some training I don't know about?" Lyra laughed, shaking her head. "No training, just feeling good lately." "Well, whatever it is, keep it up," he said, handing her a bunch of fresh basil. You look younger than last time I saw you." The words caught her off guard. She tucked the basil into her bag, thanked him, and moved along, but the comment lingered in her mind. Younger. It wasn't a word she heard often anymore, not in the way he'd meant it, genuine, without flattery. At the bakery stall, the woman behind the counter leaned in as she handed over a warm loaf. "New haircut? New skincare? You're glowing today." Lyra smiled shyly. "Nothing new, just good days, I suppose." By the time she reached the dairy counter, she'd heard it twice more. Little remarks about her energy, her complexion, her brightness, and each time she felt the same quiet flutter of gratitude in her chest. She wasn't chasing youth, that had never been her aim, but to be seen as vibrant, as alive, felt like a gift she hadn't expected. As she walked home, she thought about how different this felt compared to a year ago. Back then, she'd sometimes avoided the market when she was feeling particularly stiff or tired. She'd dreaded the small talk, worried that people could see the weariness in her face. Now she was walking taller, making eye contact, lingering at stalls to chat. The shift wasn't just in her body, it was in the way she carried herself. When she told Margaret about it later over tea, her friend grinned. "I told you, people can feel when you're more alive. It's not just how you look, it's how you move, how you speak." "It's strange," Lyra admitted. "I never set out for this to happen. I just wanted my knees to stop aching and my walks to feel easier. But it's like one thing led to another. The more I move, the better I feel. The better I feel, the more I want to live in the world again." That evening, she phoned her daughter just to tell her about it. "I had the loveliest morning," she said. "People kept telling me I looked well, and I didn't feel embarrassed or like they were just being polite. I actually believed them." Her daughter laughed warmly. "That's because it's true, Mum. You've got your sparkle back." Later, as Lyra sat in her kitchen, she glanced at the little jar of cayenne pepper by the stove. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary, just a spice in a jar. But to her, it had become a companion, a daily reminder that small, steady changes can spill over into every part of life. The compliments from the market weren't about vanity, they were about recognition that she had stepped into a new chapter where she wasn't defined by stiffness, fatigue, or decline. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded her that when you care for yourself, the world notices, even in the smallest ways. It was her granddaughter Sophie's 12th birthday that brought the whole family together. Lyra hadn't hosted a big gathering in years, not since her husband passed, but this year, her daughter had asked if they could hold the celebration at Lyra's house. "It'll be cozy, Mum," she'd said, "and besides, you've got the best garden for photos." In the days leading up to the party, Lyra moved through her home with a steady, deliberate energy. She polished the silverware, baked her famous lemon cake, and even ventured into the garden to arrange a small table with fresh flowers. She realized with some surprise that she wasn't rationing her energy like she used to. There was no quiet calculation of, if I do this now, I'll have to rest later. She was simply doing and enjoying every bit of it. On the afternoon of the party, family began trickling in, the air filled with laughter, the shuffle of chairs, the clink of glasses. Lyra moved among them easily, hugging her nephews, topping up tea for her sister, making sure the children had enough sandwiches. It was during one of these passes through the kitchen that she caught her brother watching her with a curious smile. "What?" she asked, laughing. He shook his head. "You're everywhere today. I remember last year you barely left your chair after an hour." "What's your secret?" Lyra grinned. "A little spice in my life." "Literally," her daughter, overhearing, chimed in. "It's true. She's been on this cayenne pepper kick for months now, and honestly, look at her." Later, during the group photo in the garden, Sophie tugged on Lyra's sleeve. "Grandma, you're smiling like you're my age." Lyra knelt beside her, smoothing the girl's hair. "Maybe it's because I feel more like myself again." The afternoon rolled on with the kind of joy that lingers in the air like the smell of warm cake. Lyra noticed how many times she was on her feet without thinking about it, fetching plates, carrying pitchers of lemonade, leaning in to listen to her nephew's new guitar song. Her back didn't ache. Her knees didn't complain. And perhaps most telling of all, she wasn't counting the minutes until everyone left so she could rest. When the last guests had gone and the house had settled back into its gentle quiet, Lyra sank into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. There was the good kind of tired in her bones, the kind that comes from a full day lived well, not the weary heaviness she used to carry after the simplest errands. I saw her a week later, and she told me about the gathering, her voice warm with pride. "I wasn't just there, sitting and watching," she said. "I was part of it, fully. I didn't have to pace myself or hide how I was feeling. I could keep up, enjoy it, and still be smiling at the end of the day." "That's the gift," I told her. "When you build your strength quietly, day by day, it shows up in moments like these. Moments you don't have to step back from." Lyra sipped her tea and thought for a moment. "I used to think those days were gone for me," she admitted. "But maybe they're not." And that night, as she sprinkled cayenne over her roasted vegetables, she realized something. Her journey wasn't just about feeling healthier. It was about stepping back into her own life, into the laughter, the photos, the warm chaos of family, without the shadow of pain and fatigue holding her at the edges. A few weeks after Sophie's birthday, Lyra found herself standing in front of the community center's notice board. She'd stopped there on her way back from the market, not with any particular plan, just curiosity. The board was crowded with flyers, knitting groups, language classes, yoga for seniors. Her eyes landed on one printed in bold red letters, "Spring Photography Walk, all welcome." She read the details twice. It was a 3-hour stroll through the nature reserve just outside town, cameras in hand to capture early blooms and birds in flight. In the past, she might have admired the idea, then quietly told herself it was too much walking, too tiring, too unpredictable. But as she stood there, holding her shopping bag, a thought whispered in the back of her mind. Why not? That evening, she mentioned it to Margaret over the phone. "You should do it," Margaret said without hesitation. "You've been talking about taking more photos for years, and now you can actually enjoy the walk without worrying." The following Saturday, Lyra arrived at the nature reserve with a small camera slung around her neck and a scarf tucked neatly under her coat. The group was a mix of ages, some young and eager, others older and more deliberate in their steps. The leader, a cheerful man in his 50s, welcomed her warmly and pointed toward the first trail. At first, Lyra kept to the back, taking in the scenery. The path wound gently through groves of budding trees, sunlight slipping between branches. Every so often, she lifted her camera to capture a burst of yellow daffodils or the shimmer of a robin's wing. But as the walk continued, she realized something remarkable. She wasn't trailing behind. She was keeping pace, stopping not because her legs demanded it, but because she wanted to frame a shot. Halfway through, one of the younger participants glanced at her screen. "That's a beautiful shot," he said. Lyra smiled, feeling a quiet surge of pride. She had been a painter for decades, but photography was a newer love, one she'd hesitated to explore fully because of the walking it often required. By the time they reached the last stretch, she felt a pleasant ache in her legs, the kind that comes from use rather than strain. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. Someone handed her a cup of warm tea from a thermos, and they stood together watching the afternoon light soften over the fields. When she got home, Lyra uploaded her photos and found herself smiling at the images, not just for their beauty, but for what they represented. She was doing things again. She was saying yes to invitations instead of inventing reasons to stay home. The next day, she told me about the walk during her visit. "It's funny," she said. "I used to think I needed to get stronger before I could do things like this. But maybe doing them is what's making me stronger." I nodded. That's exactly how it works. Strength isn't just something you prepare for, it's something you build by living. The confidence from that day spilled into other parts of her life. She started taking the longer route to the market just for the fresh air. She began cooking more elaborate meals, experimenting with recipes she'd once considered too much trouble. And without even realizing it, she stopped doubting whether she could manage. She simply did. Her kitchen rituals stayed the same: the morning tea, the quiet breakfast, the pinch of cayenne pepper sprinkled without fail. But now that spice wasn't just a daily habit, it was a small flame feeding a much larger fire, one that kept her moving, curious, and willing to step into the world with her camera, her walking shoes, and her growing sense of possibility. Over the months, Lyra's journey became something far greater than she ever expected. What began as a small pinch of cayenne pepper on her breakfast eggs turned into a quiet revolution in her daily life. Her stiff knees loosened, her walks grew longer, and her energy returned in ways she hadn't dared to hope for. But perhaps the biggest change was in her spirit, the quiet confidence that she could still choose how she lived each day. She found herself saying yes again, to long walks through the gardens, to photography outings, to hosting her family, without worry that her body wouldn't keep up. Her world, which had once felt smaller and more cautious, began to stretch open like the first flowers of spring. Even the people around her noticed, friends, neighbors, and family remarking on the light in her eyes, the life in her step. Lyra's story is a reminder that change doesn't have to come from grand gestures or complicated plans. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as a spice jar you'd forgotten in the back of your cupboard, and the willingness to give it a chance. So perhaps today is the day to take your own first step. It might be cayenne pepper, or maybe it's a morning walk, a stretch before bed, or a new recipe you've been meaning to try. Whatever it is, trust that even the smallest habits done with care and consistency can quietly transform not just your body, but your life. Because as Lyra learned, the years ahead are still full of color, warmth, and possibility. And sometimes all it takes is a single pinch to begin.